Chinese President Xi Jinping is set to start a historic third term as the Chinese Communist Party's General Secretary, the most powerful position in the country. At the ruling Chinese Communist Party's National Party Congress on Sunday, Xi opened the convention by praising Beijing's achievements under his rule, including the controversial zero-COVID policy and the oppression of Hong Kong's democracy, while threatening that he won't renounce a forceful reunification with Taiwan. Now, Xi's leadership has been characterized as aggressive and illiberal in both home and global affairs, leading to increasing wariness in governments and businesses dealing with Beijing. With the 69-year-old remaining in power for the foreseeable future, will China's interaction with the world lead to more tension in global politics? For insights on this, we turn to Susan Thornton, a retired senior U.S. diplomat who served as acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. She's now Senior Fellow and Visiting Lecturer in Law at the Yale Law School Paul Tsai China Center. A very warm welcome to you, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you, Soo-young.
Well, so the CCP's National Party Congress, it began on Sunday, and well, Xi is, of course, expected to serve a historic third term and possibly beyond that as well. But in the last, during the course of his leadership, we saw China not really liberalizing in correlation with the global community's expectations that economic growth would lead to more political liberalization. And Xi, in fact, he said that socialism is the only thing that can really save China. How do you think that Xi Jinping is going to continue ruling China to ensure the legitimacy of the CCP?
Well, thanks, Soo-young. These are great questions. I think for your audience, as far as the 20th Party Congress in Beijing goes, the most important thing that's going to happen at this Congress is, as you said, the anointing of Xi Jinping for a third term as Party General Secretary. Of course, that breaks the precedent that was previously adhered to of only having General Secretaries serve 2 terms, so a total of 10 years. This will let Xi Jinping serve a total of at least 15 years, and many people think there may be a term coming after that. I think, as you mentioned, China's, has dashed expectations of the global community about its potential for liberalizing. I think, any time a country extends the leadership of the same sort of leader in office, that's probably not a good sign about sort of liberalization and democratic development. So I think it's unfortunate that we see that China's had to kind of undo and unwind previous precedents to see Xi Jinping get yet another term, 15 years in power, and maybe more after that. I think that, to some extent, though, this isn't really, affecting too much the Communist Party's perceived legitimacy. Certainly among some people it might, but most people, I think, are looking more at sort of performance metrics. And in that score, from the perspective of people inside China, I think the main priorities they look at are China's economic development, modernization, and its societal stability. And I think on those 2 points, and we heard in the work report that was read in Beijing on Sunday, they touted their achievements over the last 5 years in these areas and said basically that they've done a lot to earn the respect and earn, the legitimacy for the government, I think. And I think Xi Jinping will continue to have to protect the gains that the Communist Party's made over the last 30 years in terms of the Chinese economy. That's going to be, I think, foremost on their mind coming out of this party Congress, although there are a lot of challenges on the economic front, but there are also, as Xi pointed out in the work report, a lot of challenges that they anticipate coming from the external environment with respect to their economic development and also security and stability.
And Xi Jinping, of course, on Sunday, he continued to issue threats about Taiwan. And, well, with China expected to take more aggressive steps in the future to absorb Taiwan and also expand its influence in the Indo-Pacific, do you think this makes a military clash in the region inevitable?
Well, I certainly hope not. I really don't think military conflict over Taiwan is something that we should be talking about right now. This is a problem that has, endured since 1949, basically, at the end of the Chinese Civil War. It's not something that's been resolved in the last 70 years or the last 40 years, and it's probably not going to be resolved in the coming several years. And so I think there's no urgency to this issue, and I don't think a military conflict would even necessarily succeed in resolving this issue. And so I certainly think it's not inevitable and should be avoided. I think the Chinese are looking to, expand their influence in the Indo-Pacific region in particular, commensurate with their growing power on the world stage. And that will make them more aggressive, as we have seen over the last, 10, 15 years, in trying to defend their interests and show that they, have this newfound sort of sense of a more powerful seat on the global stage and want to have a say and call the shots. And that's going to be difficult, I think, for countries in the region to grapple with, adjust to, and manage. But I don't think conflict is inevitable, no.
And well, ahead of China's National Party Congress, the United States issued its latest national security strategy, and Washington warned that it will be a decisive decade in terms of confronting Beijing and Moscow as well. And it sounds like the US will focus more on competition than engagement or diplomacy. I mean, how do you interpret the latest approach to Beijing, and do you think it's the correct approach at this time?
Yeah, I mean, the national security strategy was, of course, it came out this last week in Washington. It was delayed from, supposed to be issued back in February, was delayed due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in late February, when sort of the priorities may have perceived to be needed to be shifting a bit. So I think when, you look at the national security strategy, it really sets out these three pillars of things that the U.S. needs to focus on. One is, of course, this domestic renewal pillar that we hear so much about from President Biden and his team. The second one is the geopolitical competition with major powers like China and Russia. And then the third one is, the need to address global challenges and cooperate with other countries to do that. Things like, global health, development, and climate change. And so I think what I see coming out of that, you hear a lot of focus on the competition with geopolitical rivals piece, but really what you're looking at is, there's a need to devote resources in all three of these areas. And to the extent that you're devoting them primarily in the geopolitical competition space, you're going to have less resource to devote to the other two pillars of the things that were discussed in the national security strategy. And I think over time, that's going to become more evident than maybe it is right now. So I think the prioritization may have to shift over time.
And well, earlier this year, Chinese Politburo member Yang Jiechi, he's said that he indicated that the Xi Jinping thought on diplomacy is going to focus on security and development. And when it comes to security, it's made quite clear that Beijing will remove any barriers or attempts to thwart its growth and development, and it also introduced the Global Security Initiative. So what will the security mechanism with Chinese characteristics look like from your perspective? And do you think it's really going to threaten the liberal democratic world order?
Well, I think it's a very good question. I mean, the Chinese and Xi Jinping in particular has put forward these two new initiatives, the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative. The Global Security Initiative has a little bit less sort of detail around it. In fact, we haven't heard much detail about it at all, but we can surmise that it has to do with the fact that the Chinese believe that the sort of system of security, in particular the U.S. alliance system in Asia, is aimed sort of against China increasingly over the last several years in particular, and their concerns about sort of having a coalition of countries aimed at keeping China down or containing China's development, and also aimed at sort of containing its security or its sort of defensive ambitions as well in its near periphery. I think the Chinese probably are looking to try to gain support in the developing world for their particular grievances against the sort of U.S. what they call, hegemonic system of alliances that are sort of aimed against particular countries. And we see that to some extent in votes in the UN and other places where China is looking to increase its influence in the developing world. And so I think, whether it's a threat to the liberal democratic world is, I think, pretty hard to say at this very premature point. But certainly what China will be looking to do is to sort of better protect its security interests, especially in the Indo-Pacific. But I think this also relates to the kind of language that we've seen the Chinese issue together with Russia, for example, in that February 4th joint statement that they made, with a lot of complaints about the sort of quote-unquote hegemonic U.S. Security order in the world, and that certain countries are trying to achieve, complete security at the expense of the security of other countries. So I think that's the kind of thing that they're going to be focused on.
Well, in regards to the U.S.-China rivalry, you've said that the focus on competition is rather misplaced, and there are areas where there can be realistic progress between Washington and Beijing. Could you provide some insights on the direction that the two superpowers could potentially go?
Well, I think hopefully we'll see at the upcoming meeting in Bali, Indonesia in November at the G20, hopefully we'll see the two presidents, President Xi and President Biden, meet for the first time since President Biden's been elected in a person-to-person, face-to-face meeting. And I think at the G20, there'll be a lot of focus on global challenges, some of which will be related to the fallout from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, things like energy security, energy markets, food security, trying to make sure that there's enough shipping and supply of food, especially to the developing world. And then a focus on sort of macroeconomic conditions in the world. There's a lot of expectations about a downturn in the economy. So I think there will be a lot of coordination to be done on that. And these are all issues that the U.S. and China not only can work together on, I mean, they almost have to work together on these because they're both such huge players. I think, development in the global South is something that needs a lot of work and reform and attention. We're going to see debt-stressed countries. We're going to see defaults. The IMF and World Bank will have to be involved, and the U.S. and China are the biggest supporters and quota shareholders of those two institutions. So I think, and then climate change, of course, is an area that both countries have a lot of responsibility to try to get control of. So I think, even though there's been discussions and the Chinese have said we won't talk to you about climate change in the wake of, recent events, but I think that there's still a lot of space there for cooperation.
And well, seeing as you're here, we must talk about North Korea. Now, we've seen North Korea change its nuclear posture in September to legalize preemptive nuclear attacks. And also in recent weeks, it's revealed that it's been training its tactical nuclear forces. And it's clear that North Korea isn't President Biden's priority at the moment, with a lot of things going on globally, but there are some concerns that the administration doesn't exactly have a concrete policy or plan for North Korea. And well, our own government here in South Korea doesn't seem to have many tools to pressure the North either. So do you think President Biden and his team are prepared to respond to perhaps an even greater provocation by the North Koreans?
Yeah, there's just so much going on now in the world that it is hard to pay, close attention and sufficient attention to everything. I think the North Koreans themselves have really played a part in this, though, which is that they have been pretty closed off during COVID and pretty reluctant to engage with the international community. reluctant to talk to us even about humanitarian assistance or assistance to counter the pandemic. So I think it's not all the fault of the U.S. not having a plan. Of course, we've seen a lot of testing of weapons in North Korea. They're obviously proceeding apace in trying to develop those capabilities, and the U.S. and ROK and other partners have been unable to deter them from testing. But I kind of tend to think that it's not really a ripe time for North Korea to try to sort of whip up a crisis, because what they're probably watching is how the international community is dealing with events in Ukraine, for example, and the U.S. China deteriorating relationship, et cetera. So these are all factors that play into the game that Kim Jong-un will be looking at on his chessboard. And I think if they can continue to do the kinds of things they've been doing and get COVID under control and try to shore up their economy domestically as they've been doing, and watching all of their normal counterparts sort of fighting among themselves, that's a pretty decent, from the point of view of Kim Jong-un and North Korea, it's a pretty decent place for them to be. I mean, that's not to say, usually when North Korea is not getting attention, they try to get attention by creating a crisis. So we do have to be prepared for that. And I do think the Biden administration is prepared to respond to a crisis with its allies in the region. But we certainly hope that we don't see that crisis. On the nuclear saber rattling, I tend to think Kim Jong-un is taking some lessons here from Vladimir Putin. I really don't expect to see any kind of nuclear weapon used or any kind of attack launched. But I guess the question is whether there will be a nuclear test at some point soon, or another kind of incident or test that would be very alarming and would require a response. And I think that's something that we have to be ready to respond to.
Well, unfortunately for us, this is where we'll have to wrap up this interview. Well, that was Susan Thornton, former senior U.S. diplomat and senior fellow and visiting lecturer in law at the Yale Law School Paul Tsai Center. Thank you again so much for your insights today.
Good to be with you.
Also, thank you to our global viewers for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow at the same time here in Seoul with more insights on issues making global headlines. Again, have a great day wherever you are. Goodbye.